Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are delighted to have with us Walter Russell Mead. Professor Mead is the professor of foreign affairs and humanities at Bard College. He's a distinguished fellow in strategy and statesmanship at Hudson Institute, and you may know him more as the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal. His latest book, The Ark of the Covenant, The United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People, was called by the New York Times a best book of the year. Walter, welcome. We're delighted to have you.
It's great to be here.
Terrific. Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is, we've been obviously focused a lot on what's happening with the Hamas Israel conflict, and particularly, if you're on a college campus, it's hard to avoid completely. But are there bigger implications of this? I mean, it just seems to me that we are looking at this maybe a little too narrowly.
Well, I do think that when I talk to people from the region, there's less of a sense that this is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's put it another way. What is the main conflict in the Middle East today? And a lot of American foreign policy types, I think a lot of American, Americans who don't follow foreign policy that closely, but their emotions are invested on one side or the other in the Middle East, would say it's the Israeli-Palestinian struggle is the center of Middle East politics. Very few people in the Middle East believe that. There's some Palestinians who wish it were true, but in general, people say it's the conflict of Iran with the Sunni world, the Sunni Arab world is the big conflict. And to some degree, Iran with the United States, although the United States is doing its best not to be part of that conflict. And
so the stakes there are for domination of the Muslim world.
Well, I would say that's putting it a little aggressively, but I think for domination of the oil resources of the Middle East, and certainly then also the religious sites in Saudi Arabia, that the Iranians would love to get their hands on all that stuff. The idea is that if you really control the oil resources of the Middle East, you're a great power. You can hold up the economy of the world to ransom. You don't need OPEC anymore. You are OPEC. And the Iranians would very much like to have that power.
But why is I've never been able to figure out why Obama and Biden thought that we could deal with these people given what they say about us. I mean, didn't anybody read Mein Kampf?
Joel, have you ever shopped for rugs in the Middle East?
I've been in souks. I've never bought anything.
All right. Well, I think what you find is that you spend a lot of time bargaining, and at the end, you're paying pretty much. You're paying more than the rug dealer would for a similar rug by a very, very wide margin. And I think Americans are kind of straightforward people. We tend to not be interested in twists and turns and subtleties. And the Iranians are extremely good at that. And the Biden people and the Obama people were seduced on the one hand by, they're these moderates. And really the only thing that's keeping the hardliners in power is American opposition. And so just like in Aesop's fable, if you stop being the cold north wind and the rain, and you become the warm sunshine, then Iran will open up and friendship will be possible, and the natural democratic tendencies of the Iranian people will triumph. Okay. And they believed it. I mean, I've talked to very, very senior people in the world of democratic foreign policy, and they believe that. But I think maybe one reason they were so willing to believe that is because for President Obama, and I think also for President Biden, they asked themselves, as one logically should when thinking about the Middle East, what's the worst thing that could happen from an American point of view? What do you really at all costs want to avoid? And for them, while I don't think either of them wants or wanted an Iranian nuclear bomb, actually the worst thing in the Middle East is a U.S.-Iran war. Because imagine what you're like. You're a Democratic president. If you're Obama, you're the whole pillar of your campaign is, I knew that Iraq war was a terrible thing, a war in the Middle East to bring democracy or to get weapons of mass destruction. We can't do anything so stupid ever again. And then you do it. Or the same thing for Biden. Think about the state of the Democratic Party today. Look at what we've seen since October 7th about the feelings of the left. And he's got, so if President Biden were to find himself in some kind of war with Iran in the Middle East, he'd have a divided party. I actually don't think that Donald Trump would necessarily think, I don't really like Joe Biden, but the patriotic thing to do is to support our president in wartime. I don't know, maybe I'm a cynic, Joel, but there's something that tells me that's not the path that Donald Trump would take. Right. So there are solid political reasons why someone like Joe Biden might just think war with Iran is not an option. The trouble is, if you think that way and the Iranians figure it out, then they can push your buttons anytime they want, and there's a lot they can do. My sense is they have figured it out, they have read us correctly, and they are pushing.
So if you were Iran, following out your economic view of this, which is that underlying all of this is Iran's desire for hegemony over the oil resources. Your worst nightmare as Iran would be American energy independence. And that, so how does that figure?
Not really, because America might be energy independent, but Europe won't be, Japan won't be, China won't be, India won't be, etc. And even
unless we become the suppliers to them.
Well, that's different from energy independence.
Yeah,
but
true.
We cannot, even with shale, we are not going to replace the Middle East. We can supplement the Middle East, but we will not replace the Middle East. And for countries like Europe, that it's right across the Mediterranean, it's not, I think that's a little unrealistic.
Yeah.
And so Iran, and the thing is, but we have all the oil we want, but Japan is depending on the Middle East. Iran cuts it off, and oil is $200 a barrel in Japan. What happens to the Japanese economy? What happens to American companies that are invested in Japan? What happens to stock markets? What happens to interest rates? We're not economically independent of the rest of the world, even if we're energy independent. So I don't think I think it's a rational thing on their point of view to say that control of those energy resources gives you an enormous revenue, and it gives you a lot of leverage over the rest of the world.
A minute ago, you were talking about how you feel as though the Iranians have read us correctly, or they're tuning into what it is that we're doing and our calculus. A couple of weeks ago, you wrote a really interesting article in the Journal about Iran not really getting what they were hoping to get out of the Gaza war. Elaborate a little bit on that. How do you think Iran is looking at this Hamas Israel war, and what is it they're not getting?
Right, not getting yet, I said. It's possible as the war goes on, they will get it. They have not given up hope, that's for sure. Well, the Iranians, look, the Biden people have figured out that that if they just try to do what Obama did, which is essentially reach out to the Iranians over the heads of the Israelis, the Saudis, the other Gulf states, that's actually destabilizing in the Middle East, because as those countries, as our allies get panicky about our intention to both make a deal with Iran and walk away from the Middle East, all kinds of things will be happening that we don't want to happen. The Israelis might strike Iran, who knows what, right? So you need to reach out to both. And this is what I think Biden has figured out in the last year or so, that your outreach to Iran, especially since they are not actually going back into the JCPOA in spite of everything that Biden has done to try to sweeten the deal. You need to, you need to kind of soothe and settle the Saudis and the Israelis. And so what have we been doing? We're offering a major alliance and strategic guarantee that they would work in together as a coalition. Now, this would have two impacts. One is that it does, I think, from the Biden administration point of view, one of the things it does is it increases the chance that the Israelis won't attack Iran if it crosses the nuclear threshold. Because, after all, Europe, Russia's had nuclear weapons since the 1940s, deterrence. And so the Biden administration is hoping that an umbrella of deterrence could actually, they don't want an Iranian bomb, but it's hard to see how they're going to stop one. If it comes, this is a way to deal with it without a war. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that it definitely weakens Iran in the region, and it facilitates cooperation among our allies with at least some American backing to hold the line against Iran. Iran, this will shock you, didn't like that idea and is looking for ways to disrupt it. And so, one of the things you can do is you can create a political explosion that makes everyone in the Middle East forget how much they hate the Persian Shia heretics who've been responsible for all the massacres in Syria and the destruction of Lebanon, and it caused all kinds of mayhem in Iraq, and are going to town in Yemen. You forget how much you hate them, and you remember how much you hate all those Jews in Israel. And you try to wrench politics back into this old Arab-Israeli framework and make it impossible for the governments of those countries to continue working with Israel. Now, so far, the other governments have basically been doubling down on their sense of Iran is the real problem. Israel, worst case, Israel would like the West Bank. And the other Arabs don't want that to happen, but it's a limited ambition. And Israel is so small that no matter what it does, it can't threaten the Arab world generally in the Middle East. It's not that kind of a problem, while Iran very much is that kind of a problem. So cooperating with Israel against Iran makes sense to you as a Sunni Arab monarch, especially, regardless of these other things.
Well, especially when you add in the technological upside that you get by cooperating with Israel in terms of potential improvements to your own economy and diversification of your own economy.
Well, and I think, there's that. I think there's a tendency a bit to exaggerate the impact of that, because there's a lot of places you can buy technology. You may not have noticed this, but they have a lot of money in the Gulf. And there are a lot of people from Silicon Valley. If the Arabs say we have a list of things we want to buy, vendors are going to appear, and they are going to offer to work with you in very friendly ways. But yes, it's an additional thing. I think it's the fact that Israel is existentially committed to not wanting Iran to dominate the region, which they are. I think that's the core of it.
What about in terms of U.S. politics? It seems that this conflict has really created a huge crisis in the Democratic Party. I don't mean to be a supporter of the squad, which I'm obviously not, but I look at the big contributors to the Democratic Party, the big contributors to Biden. A lot of them are Jewish. The universities, which are the center of a lot of this political disruption, get a lot of money from Jewish people. Is there some reshuffling of political allegiance around this coming up in the U.S. or?
I look at the top universities, and I would actually say there is a divorce already taking place between American Jews and leading universities. I've seen some articles about the collapse of Jewish enrollment in the Ivies and so on. And so it seems reasonably clear that there will be fewer American Jews in the next generation of Ivy professors and so on. That changes more slowly. So I think there is a divergence happening between these communities that is older. And honestly, Harvard University doesn't give a rat's patootie what the donors think. It has plenty of money. It has about something like $40 billion
48
in its endowment. 48 billion. Well, I'm glad they've been successful. And
all of that paid for me, by the way, as a graduate.
Right.
So
well, actually, my rule with Yale has been when they ask me for money that, look, when I think poor Yale is having to hobble by on a bit less than Harvard, maybe 35, 40 billion. I don't know the number. But basically, let's say it's 35. When I'm worth $36 billion, I am going to give $500 million to Yale because I believe it is unseemly to be wealthier than your alma mater. That is, that's
the kind challenge that's coming up.
That's the kind of nouveau riche, brash,
embarrassment of riches. Right, exactly.
I was raised a gentleman, and I'm not going to
be gauche.
Do anything so gauche. Exactly. But until that point, and we're not quite there yet. Okay.
Well, what does this say, though, about what the future of progressivism is? I mean, if you think the universities and the media are really the base of the progressives in this country, is this Israel-Hamas conflict and the specter of anti-Semitism, is that going to change the progressives? Will the squad become the majority in the long run?
There's a lot going on in this. We tend to conflate immigrant groups and blacks as the new, BIPOC color. And it's clear that the progressive movement, so to speak, and the Democratic Party more generally would like for that to happen, for Americans from Central and South America to think of themselves as a racial group like blacks who have no path to assimilation into normal Americans. Ditto. I mean, normal. I should make sure I'm doing this because we're all normal. When did that happen?
Yeah.
We're all normal. And and then there's, but then the reality is, if we look at statistics and so on, they're not, Asian Americans are not that necessarily interested in being a pressure group or an outside group. Immigrants, by and large, still seem to want to become part of America. And so we're seeing a struggle here. How do you define yourselves? Where do you go? And it ultimately has something to do, I think, with who do you vote for? And American Jews are an interesting community because while the other, majority of American Jews descend from people who came to the U.S. in what I call the Great Wave of immigration between about 1890 and 1923. And compared to the other groups in that migration, everybody's become more assimilated, everybody's become more powerful of those groups of immigrants. Jews, however, have remained staunchly democratic and on the left in a way that Irish Americans really haven't been, or Italian Americans, or you name it. And so, in a sense, that's the exception. And the Jews have continued to, the majority of American Jews have continued to see themselves as part of this insurgent, progressive element. And they're now, I think we're seeing the latest generations are not seeing, they're looking at American Jews and saying, you guys have been here for a long time. You're established. You're not actually one of us. Numerically, that's not going to make a difference to the size of a measurable difference to the size of the progressive alignment. I don't want to shock you guys, but there's actually not that many Jews in the United States.
Well, no, about 7 million.
Much less the world. But let me
right. Although I don't know. I heard something the other day. You may have heard this. What is the difference between Donald Trump and a liberal Jewish billionaire? Liberal Jewish billionaire? Donald Trump has Jewish grandchildren.
Yeah,
That's very good. You know, funny, you recently in your Ark of the Covenant book look back at the history of support for Zionism and how the Zionist goal has really was shaped by and shaped in return the evangelical Christian movement. So my question really is not so much what's going to happen on the progressive side. My question is whether or not you think support for Israel will continue to be solid among the right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's, like everything else in the world, it's a question, and that great American sage Yogi Berra used to say, among his many other words of wisdom, that prediction is always dangerous, and especially when it involves the future.
Right. When you see a fork on the road, take it.
Yeah, exactly. So predictions are hard to say. I think in some ways what we've seen with the demographic collapse of the old mainline congregations, many of whom actually were never, there was always a strain of liberal Christian Zionism, but a lot of the mainline churches were often quite anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. So as people coming out of evangelical backgrounds, in a sense, are now filling the space, the void in American society left by the collapse of the mainline Protestants, you are getting what you can think of as mainline Jellicals, who, have more of the theological conservatism, although, that tends to fade over time, but also some of the more socially liberal attitudes, and also position. They're not outsiders, they're not Pentecostal cotton farmers, outside of Natchez. They are doctors, lawyers, they're inside American society, and these people do seem to be adopting some of the political ideas. And that can also be a kind of a less Zionist thing. So you always, the one, I think, universal human thing is that you want to be different from your parents. You don't want to just be like those old fogies. And so if the old evangelicals were really pro-Israel, one of the ways that you can kind of say, you can signal not only I'm different from my parents, but like I fit in college, I fit in with the crowd, is like you just step away from the Zionist stuff. So I think we are definitely seeing in one wing of this movement, we're seeing some change. Others, not so much. And Pentecostals are really interesting. They tend to be much more pro-Israel. I was thinking about I have a lady who comes in once a week and cleans my house, and I was having a reception for there was a visiting Israeli person who was here, and I was having some journalists over for an off-the-record briefing. Journalists of different points of view and stuff, and she told me that she hadn't felt good that week and had almost decided to call and not come in. She'd canceled all her other appointments, but for some reason she decided to come in and clean my place. And I said, I'm really glad to see you because I have this guy from Israel coming in tonight. She says, it must be God's will. That I told this to a Jewish friend. He said, open the borders now.
It's sort of funny that you talk about that. My younger daughter goes to Sarah Lawrence's, having not a very good time with that great pinnacle of liberalism. My other daughter works in a blue-collar job in Tucson, overwhelmingly with Mexican Americans, and they all support Israel.
Yeah. So, that's part of the history of the politics of Zionism or pro-Israel politics in America and anti-Israel politics. Somebody leaves a room, somebody comes into the room. It's a movable feast. It's not that there are these fixed groups. As you know, as I write in ARC, in the 1940s and 50s, Israel was a left-wing cause.
Right.
It was actually, it was Paul Robeson, the great communist black bass, that magnificent singer, actually performed at a benefit concert for Irgun, during World War II. So it's the black left, the white left. In the 1950s, Israel was the poster child of the Democratic Socialists of America, because it was the example of how socialism worked.
Right, kibbutz economy.
Far more left-wing than any other country in the West, so to speak. And the socialists would say, oh, you say socialism means no free elections? Look at Israel. You say socialism means weak defense? Look at Israel. You say socialism means the economy doesn't grow? Look at Israel. Now, actually, in the 1970s, Israel becomes more Thatcherite. But that was, so the political base of emotional attachment to Israel in American politics keeps changing. So far, it always, somebody new comes in of that coalition when somebody goes out, old goes out. But again, Yogi Berra's point, it's the future. We cannot know what's coming next.
Well, it seems to me that one of the big erosions in the support for Israel has come through college campuses. Joel and I recently wrote an article called Mullah from Mullahs, where we researched where the foreign donations to U.S. universities were coming from and the disproportionate influence of Qatar and Saudi Arabian money. It seems to me that this has been a kind of a 40-year plan to create Arab studies programs to kind of undermine the liberal arts education and view of Israel on the college campus. Is that pretty much aligned with what your thinking is?
Well, I would have to say I would not put Saudi Arabia and Qatar in the same camp. And I think it might be interesting to, I suspect the Saudis don't look at American campuses with, unbridled joy at the moment. Support for Hamas, support for this kind of radicalism. That right now is not where the Saudis are at all. Historically, it was different. So I actually think it would be, one of the things to look at is the role of Saudi money changing? How has it changed? What are the differences between Saudi and Emirati money, say, on the one side, and Qatari money on the other? That would be quite interesting to see. But they're not. I mean, this idea that the Arab street is not a monolith, and neither is the Arab suite where the rulers are. And it's more important than ever. The Abraham Accords showed some of the fissures, but as I write in Ark of the Covenant, the Saudi and Israeli defense cooperation goes back quietly at least to the 1960s, when they were working together to block Nasser in Yemen. So this is, these kind of stereotypes we have about Arab this and Israeli that. We do need to look in a little bit deeper. That said, yes, I do wonder, although I have to say, I've met a lot of the folks, obviously, in this Middle East studies universe and the kind of bubble of the resistance wing of the American Academy Middle East Studies. They don't actually need anybody else's money to tell them what to do. They're willing, eager, they're ready. And I think it's a little, yes, the money makes things easy and stuff like that, but much more important is the shift in the climate. And that's where we really have to think about what's going on. And historically, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Americanism often run together. The chances are, if somebody is burning an Israeli flag, they're not actually en route to a Young Americans for Freedom meeting, or they're not reading a favorable biography of Margaret Thatcher, right? Chances are, if they think that Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza, Winston Churchill is not one of the historical figures that inspires them, and neither is Franklin Roosevelt, right? So this, I think, is, to say, okay, it's the fault of this Arab government or it's the fault of this funding stream. Yes, it's worth following up, and I think we should. But why has the younger, so many in the elite of the next generation, or the people at least who think they're going to be in the elite of the next generation, have gone down this path? I do think, I wonder how representative these students are actually of opinion, because I think some of the most woke bureaucrats in the entire system are in the admissions departments of these schools. And I really do wonder, suppose university boards and presidents made clear that a basic qualification for admission was that you had demonstrated the maturity and the judgment to be able to engage in serious academic and intellectual disputation of very controversial topics, and that someone who is unable to hear some position without feeling hurt or frightened, well, as a human being, I can sympathize with that person, but is that person ready to take up one of a precious small number of slots at institutions whose role is to help promote the next generation of American leaders? Maybe they're not ready, right? Yeah. And I have to tell you, if that kind of word got out, that a dozen presidents of leading colleges made that statement and were actually enforcing it, and by the way, you can fire admissions department, they don't have tenure, and they're administrators, they're not faculty who don't have to listen to anybody, and I speak as a faculty member here. They are, they have jobs, and they can be given instructions, and they can be monitored for compliance. Think how fast Dalton School and some of these elite high schools would change their curriculums and approach, because their business model is, you give us $65,000 a year for 4 years and your kid gets into a top 10 school. That's their business model. They have nothing else. And they are, I was about to say, they are of extremely easy and persuadable virtue when it comes to, like, how do they carry out, they will carry out that mission. So you could change high school curriculums, and you would very quickly change the climate on campus. Another thing you can do is you can say, in terms of promotion and faculty hiring, retention, promotion, and tenure, we are looking for evidence that this faculty member is able to offer a classroom environment of genuine intellectual diversity, contestation, where students are, develop their skills for civil disagreement, and are exposed to a wide variety of points of view, some of which might come from Hamas and even Osama bin Laden. I am talking about diversity here, but also, amazingly, occasionally somebody who actually kind of thinks America isn't the worst country ever also gets in there and gets civilly discussed. Again, I think, these are things, they don't infringe anybody's personal freedom, academic freedom. They are about promoting discussion, not shutting it down or restricting. These are things, I think, as a practical matter, could actually be done, and I think they could have a significant impact faster than you might expect.
But the only question,
very tangible suggestions, Joel.
Yeah, I mean, we just got a very good response from a petition which raised some of these issues at Chapman. But the question I have is, isn't it going to require new institutions that these departments, particularly in the liberal arts, are so 9, 10, 20, sometimes 30 to 1 on one ideology? I mean, don't you have to create some sort of new institution to combat that?
I think, in some cases, things, there are some institutions that may have gone too far, some departments. But I'm also, I look at history, and I am a great believer in the Vicar of Bray. Do you know that? It's a reference to there was a song in 18th century England about this guy who was vicar, that's a church official. And he says, when Charles II was in charge, I talked about don't touch the Lord's anointed. I was a huge monarchist, right? James II comes in, and I'd have been a Catholic, except, he fell too fast. Then the next king comes in, and he's a zealous Protestant, and he keeps changing. And he's like, whatsoever king may reign, I'll be the Vicar of Bray, sir. And I don't want to impugn anybody's orthodoxy or idealism, but very often for the bulk of people, there's a relationship between the location of their rice bowl and the direction of at least their conduct, if not always their thinking. And so I think there may be more space for gradual reformation if there is a will at the top and determination to do it. And if you add to that you bring in new students who are ready for intellectual diversity, seek it out, the climate of promotion and retention and influence is promoting that. I think, you might well see some changes. Not that you're going to get rid of everything, but you know what? I don't want to get rid of every communist on a university campus somewhere in the United States. I actually, a little bit like smallpox, getting a mild dose of it in your youth can prevent a much worse infection later on.
Well, plus your point about, supporting the diversity of thinking just for the pure purpose of creating better debating skills.
Right. Well, also young people who can keep their heads in a world where they're going to be, with the internet and mass communications, ideas that used to be that there would be ideas that everybody believed in Lebanon, but no one in New Jersey even knew existed. They seemed outlandish, weird. All right. We're all living more and more in an environment when there's nothing like that. And, combination of immigration and the internet, we are living in these global spaces. And so kids have to be able to, you might know somebody who's a Hindu nationalist and thinks Modi is a really fantastic guy. Somebody else who's thinks Erdogan has really got great ideas for Turkey. You're gonna know anti-Semites. You're gonna know strong Zionists. You're gonna know the era of bubbles is ending. And so what do we need to educate kids in? The ability to look at these different things, evaluate them in some kind of serious way, and keep their psychological balance in a world that is in many ways trying to unsettle them all the time. That is a necessary life skill, and college is where you should be learning it.
You have to have the same experience Marshall and I have had, where they come into school, into college, knowing nothing. They know no history. They couldn't tell you the difference between World War I and World War II. They don't.
I have sometimes said to some of my students, if you want to sue your high school for educational malpractice, I am ready to testify on your behalf in your trial.
But you're right. We have to, probably the enemy here is Manichaeism, right? The idea of just either black or white polarization. If we can't find a way of reigniting people's ability to pull things apart, debate the positives and negatives in order to be able to get someplace, we're doomed.
But I would stick up a bit for Joel's point too, that I know I was in a actually very civil conversation with a group of students at my own college, Bard College, and student asked a question. She said, there 11,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza in the last month. What's the difference between that and genocide? And she was asking in the sense of well, you're not going to have an answer for that. And what I did, and I said, well, look, genocide, this is actually legal, people use this in a legal term, and I'm not a lawyer, but let me just try to give you some context. that on one night in March of 1945, American warplanes flying over Tokyo dropped incendiary bombs, and it killed about 83,000 Japanese civilians in one night. And in the last 5 months of the war in 1945, not even counting Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Americans killed about 900,000 Japanese, again, largely civilian. At Potsdam, the Allies and the U.S. agreed to the ethnic cleansing of 12 million Germans from the Sudetenland and Prussia and other places, not contested lands really, but places where their families had lived for centuries. Women and children were driven out into the snow in horrific conditions. Many died. Not to say, hey, so nothing matters, but to try to help people understand what history is and why it is has been so important, why we work so hard to try to build a world order of some kind, and however imperfect, after 1945, and what is at risk if that starts to fall apart, and how what we're seeing in Gaza, which, yes, it is partly this Arab-Israeli struggle, but ultimately without Iranian money and training and stuff, none of this would have happened. This is actually one of the frontiers in this battle to try to preserve a decaying world order, which is under significant attack on many fronts. So, again, perspective. And this gets to Joel's point that when you really don't know anything about how we got here, and you see on TV or on TikTok corpses and bombed out houses, you have the very natural human reaction. There are Israelis who've lost family in Gaza who are, just really sad about the destruction in Gaza. It's a human thing to look at this and not go, yeah, my side's winning, but to go, oh my God. But if you don't have a historical context, if you don't know what history is full of and how blessed and fortunate we are here in the US, but even just in the last 50 years, despite all the bloodshed and all the wars, you really, things like this will knock you off your balance, and you won't know how to respond. And your natural human response to great suffering will lead you into all kinds of mistaken political judgments simply because you don't know any better.
Well, Walter, I can't think of a better way of ending this session. This is just fantastic words to live by. And by the way, for people who are watching this, I cannot recommend more highly Walter's book, Ark of the Covenant. It is just, speaking of filling in the blanks on historical knowledge and giving you what you need to be able to really understand the context of the Middle East crisis. It's a phenomenal book. So, Walter, thank you so much for joining us on the Feudal Future podcast.
The Feudal Future.